Next up is Levitate. This is sorry. This is another one that vampires start with, but that is very common outside of that, and I don't think this will surprise anyone, but Levitate is indeed a top tier spell. The only reason it's not higher than Dig is because there's only really one effect that you can get that has a Dig effect. There's one other, but it's hard locked to a specific class we'll get to in a little bit. Levitate, there are many items that will do this for you that you can wear and that are actually quite good, right? There's even an artifact cloak that levitates you automatically. Very cool stuff. Comes online too late to be useful, but there's boots of levitation, rings of levitation, and then there's also the alternative spell down here you can see, Flutter, which will get you in anywhere that Levitate will, generally speaking. Levitate is very powerful, but Dig is just, it's a scarcity issue, right? Levitate has many different forms. Dig has 3. One of them will clutter up your inventory in the form of pickaxes, one of them is Dig, and one of them is hard locked behind a very specific class. So, not much to be done about that. We don't really need to talk about Levitate too much, other than to say it's very helpful for getting into a handful of the secret areas in the mid to late game, and makes a lot of the game much easier, for sure. Especially for the vampire race that starts with it. Next up we got Polymorph. Polymorph is another one that is reasonably common in the mid to late game, but the Succubus does start with it. So, it is worth noting that that is the easiest access to it. Polymorph is great for monster races. Mostly you're going to be relying on things like polymorph potions to interact with humans and shopkeepers. The Succubus can do that from basically the start of the game. I will say for the Succubus specifically, I consider Polymorph to be A tier, because they have guaranteed access to it, and once you hit 40 mana, you can start turning into a human and doing shopkeeper stuff, getting your trading skill up, very handy. However, for most players that don't start with it, it's a B tier. I will say it's probably around here in terms of usefulness. A little bit more useful than Remove Curse, but not as useful as good healing options and consistent DPS. Again, if you're a Succubus, this jumps up quite a bit because you get free access to it at the start of the game. For everyone else, you may not get access to it, and if you had the option to choose between this and Troll's Blood, I would narrowly pick Troll's Blood a lot of the time. In addition, Polymorph is useless if you're a human. So and really, honestly, it's pretty useless if you're an automaton. So that's 2 races that just don't get much value out of Polymorph. So, it's good. It ain't great, but it is good. Next up is Teleport. I'm gonna be honest with you. Teleport is the other spell that I think goes in D tier. Teleport is the other spell that the Succubus starts with. And it's mid, brothers. It is, it's not good. There's pretty much no use for it. The only time you would use it is if you were about to get beat to death, and you happen to switch over to Teleport and cast it in time before getting beat to death, and it teleported you somewhere safe. But it also could teleport you into a boulder trap or something, so meh. I don't know what would make Teleport good. Maybe if it worked more like Dash, but you could teleport in a direction, which would be a free way to avoid, it would allow you to avoid places where you would normally need levitation. That might be kind of cool, but that also might be a little bit overpowered. It'd be a blink spell in Barony. That might be a little bit wild. I don't know if it would be that much stronger than Dash, though, especially if it had a long wind-up. I don't know. I think there are some things that could be done to make it a little bit better, but as is, it's mediocre at best. I will say I put it slightly higher than Stoneblood, only because, again, I never see Stoneblood, and when I do, it's late game, and when I do, I don't use it. Whereas, at least Teleport, even though I'm probably not going to use it, I do have it at the start of the game. If I want to use it, I at least have it. Next up, we have the Automatons, racial spell, Salvage. You can find this in the dungeon. All of these spells that we're currently talking about you can find in the dungeon, just out there. I will note when it is so unique that you can't find spell books of it, which I think is only for class abilities? Babyface? Question mark? Uncertain. Either way, Salvage is a very useful spell for automatons to have. It just converts any gear laying around into scrap and magic scrap for you. Pretty solid stuff. I can't really put it above C tier though, because it's only really good for automatons. If you're a tinkerer and you find this spell, you're not going to stop salvaging stuff because you want the XP from it, right? So there's not really any use for this outside of the automaton race itself, where it is very strong. It's S tier for them. Otherwise they would starve to death. But it is basically D tier for everyone else. So compromise, put it in C tier. I will say there can be uses where maybe you are a high enough tinkering level that you no longer get XP from salvaging things, and in that situation, then maybe you would use salvage. Maybe. Other than that, it's just decent for leveling up your magic and casting. Here we have the insectoid spells, and yeah, there was a second poison spray there. For insectoids, this poison spray is more of a B tier or A tier spell because you get it for free, but you know, it doesn't really change all that much. Dash and Flutter, however, you can find these in the dungeon. Flutter especially is pretty common in my experience. I'm going to say Flutter goes up into probably, I would put Flutter all the way at almost the top of A tier. It's a decent stand-in for Levitation that will let you do most things that Levitation would let you do. It's solid. It's decent. It's definitely discount Levitation. You'd rather have Levitation, but it's not the worst thing ever to get Flutter. I would put it higher than Cold, although Cold's a little bit better in the early game. Insectoids are one of two races that can, in fact, get to fly-only areas in the mines, right? Because they both have levitation options, which is pretty solid. It's pretty handy. Dash is one of those ones that I personally think is more of a C tier, but a lot of people really love Dash, and there are some playstyles where Dash is really powerful. So I'm going to put it here. Personally, I would put Polymorph like way higher than Dash, but this is sort of a compromise between me and you, Dash lovers. Dash is fun, and I could see how you could get some decent use out of it. Plus, if you're playing as a non-magic focused insectoid, and you just wanted to spam Dash to get around faster, it's pretty useful for that. So, there you go. Next up, we've got the Incubus unique spells. I'm just realizing I accidentally put 2 teleport other spells on this list as well. We're going to ignore that, though. Didn't happen. And we're going to get into Arcane Mark. Arcane Mark is S tier. It is slightly better than Sleep because it stays relevant all throughout the game. What Arcane Mark does is it allows you to strip an enemy of all of their resistances. I'm pretty sure it works on everything. I don't think there are any enemies it doesn't work on. Maybe bosses, I'm not sure. But this is really helpful because late game enemies like kobolds have a lot of magic resist, right? And if you are a mage, getting access to Arcane Mark is top tier. Arcane Mark is basically the reason why the Incubus is an insanely good magic race. I would say probably the third best magic race if you want to go like min-maxy. Automatons and vampires are kind of vying for 1 and 2, and then Incubus is a solid third place option because of Arcane Mark. Arcane Mark also has other weird interactions, namely that if you cast Arcane Mark on something and then cast Teleport Other, it will teleport the target to the target that was Arcane Marked? It's something like that. It's weird. Teleport Other is a weird spell for weirdos. And I honestly think it probably should be down here, but it's so much better than teleport, and I legitimately think that I would get more use out of it than any of these three. So I'm putting it up here. It's a weird spell. I don't fully understand it myself, or its interactions with Arcane Mark even. But it is nevertheless a unique spell effect that can be useful in the right circumstances. Overall, though, the Incubus, much like the Succubus, has one good and one pretty doo-doo racial spells. Now we're getting into class-based spells, alright? These are spells that are either fully unique to the class, or are most likely going to be experienced by players via the class. And I will note each of those as we go through. So starting off, we have... Well, actually, I need to move this guy over here. We have Revert Form, which is in a weird spot, so we're going to talk about it first. And we have Rat Form. So Revert Form, or True Form, is a spell that is only innately given to the Shaman class. However, you can find Revert Form elsewhere in the dungeon, just in random books. Why? I don't know. The only real use for it is to get out of your own polymorph, really. It doesn't really have much of a use outside of that. And there's no way to get any of the other forms as spellbooks. So, well, that's not true. There is one. Talk about that in a second. But overall, the Revert Form spell is kind of useless by itself. It's a D tier. The only reason I'm not going to count it as a D tier, I'm going to leave it here, but I'm not going to fully count it as D tier, is just because for the Shaman class that starts with it, it is insanely good. So, keep that in mind. Rat Form is the first form that is available to the Shaman class, though. Rat Form mostly is going to level up your dexterity with a little bit of intelligence and I think perception. Those are sort of the big three that it focuses on. Mostly dex, then int, and then I think a little bit of perception as well. Rat Form is interesting. It does allow you to get leadership early on by making friends with rats, and it is very fast. Overall, I think that the Rat Form is kind of underrated, to be honest with you. I think Rat Form is a B tier. Rat Form is pretty good, just across the board. Being so fast and being able to make early leadership levels via friendship with rats is pretty nice. You also won't get beat to death by Algernon, which is always cool. It falls off a little bit in the kind of mid to late game, but I think Rat Form is probably the third best option for the Shaman. The reason it's not higher is because of its two spells that it gets access to. Both of these spells can be found in the dungeon normally as spellbooks. Detect Food is the first one. Detect Food is not quite D tier, but it is like barely above Salvage, because at least this works for most races in the game instead of only one. Overall, though, Detect Food, not good most of the time. If you're in a pinch and you're really hungry, you can cast it and you might be able to be okay, but outside of that, it's pretty mediocre. I think it needs to be a lot cheaper in terms of mana cost so that it can kind of be spammed early on, which will help with leveling, and also people are more likely to use it that way. Otherwise, it's just pretty bad. The next option that the rat has, though, is Speed, and Speed is an absolute B tier spell effect. I would put it here, honestly. I'm not going to try and rate where the forms go in, like, how does the rat form compare to extra healing? I'm not going to try that. I'm just going to leave the forms on the end of the columns that they belong in, because I just don't really care that much about that. Like, that's such a granular discussion. Like, would I rather be a rat or have extra healing? I don't know. I'm not going to worry about it. But in terms of the speed spell effect itself, I would definitely rather have this than Cure Ailment or Identify, 90% of the time. The speed spell is an AoE, so it will affect your teammates as well as any minions you might have, and that feels really good. Before going into a boss fight or like the Minotaur maze or something, you can toss down speed, and it can be helpful sometimes. Overall, though, one pretty mid spell and one pretty bad spell means that the rat form can't really go much higher than B tier, even though its early game is pretty solid once you get used to handling it. The next one is Spider. Now, the Spider form is unique, because this is the only one of these alternate form spells that you can actually find in the dungeon. If you kill the mini-boss human, named Anansi, she will drop the spellbook of Spider form, which will also, I believe, give you the revert form spell. I think? Could be wrong about that. This is the only way that I know of to get that spell outside of playing as a shaman, which is interesting, but don't count on it. Now, Spider form, I think, gets a little bit of a bad rap, but I am still going to put it in C tier. Now, I will say it's very close to rat form. Either of these are good, and the spells that the Spider form starts with are at least pretty okay. I believe they get poison, don't they? I want to say. Either way, the key spell that they get is Spray Web, which we'll talk about in a second. I will note here, I believe that the Spider mostly levels your perception, if I remember right, and then a little bit dexterity as well, which is kind of a weird spread, but it is what it is. Spiders are a little bit rare in the game right now, in my opinion, which is funny because just the other day we posted a short that was of us getting attacked by Shalab and a bunch of spiders. However, that aside, spiders are kind of rare, and they're really only found in the very, very early game. So being able to make friends with spiders falls off pretty hard, but unlike with the rat, you can't start making friends, on floor 1. Because you don't unlock spider form until level 4? I want to say it was. Somewhere around there. Character level 4, to be clear. So overall, spider form kind of mid. However, Spray Web does give it a unique effect that can be very helpful early on. Now, Spray Web itself, I'm gonna be honest with you, not super impressive. But when combined with the spider form itself, getting it for free, it's pretty good. So what Spray Web does, and we're just going to preemptively move this here. What Spray Web does is slows the enemy, right? So again, we have another spell that does slow but better. And also gives them the webbed debuff, which means that when you melee attack them in any way, they will be knocked back. Now, why this is cool is you can hit a troll with this in spider form, punch him with your little pedipalps, and then run away. And because the unarmed attack you make against the troll pushes him back, as long as you're pretty decent on your timing for the turn and run, you can infinitely kite him while he's webbed without him being able to hit you back. It's a little bit nerve-wracking. It's definitely weaker than using the poison effects, or cold, or bloodletting to kite a troll. Certainly scarier than sleep. But it is a decent option, and it is a reason why I think that Spider Form is not quite D tier. Otherwise, I just am not impressed with Spider Form. I don't like the stat spread that it gives you. I don't think it's very good. And I also don't think that you can get a ton of good, friendship options out of the existing spiders. Meaning, it's just kind of mid across the board. On the polar opposite of that spectrum, we've got Troll Form, which goes all the way up to A tier immediately. Troll Form is top dog in a lot of ways. You get it at level 7, character level 7. It mostly scales Constitution and Strength. Big fan of that. It gets a pretty massive armor bonus when you switch over because of the con bonus it gets, and it punches like a dump truck in the early game. If you're a big fan of unarmed, Troll Form can out DPS monks at similar levels if you're building well. Overall, Troll Form's pretty good. You get a little bit squishy in the late game because you can't like wear armor and stuff, but that goes for all of the animal forms. It's not really a unique weakness to the troll. In addition, troll form cuts your int, I believe it is, maybe perception. So you're, you know, a little bit weaker in the spellcasting department, but overall still quite good. And of course, being able to make friends with other trolls is really powerful, right? Especially if you can get a Thumpus. But even without Thumpus, right, you don't need a mini-boss to have good followers with this form. You just be a troll, make friends with other trolls, profit, right? It's great. The troll gets access to 2 spell effects. The first one we're going to talk about is the one that anybody can find in the dungeon. It's the Fear effect. This one is pretty mediocre. I'm going to say that I would put this probably at the bottom of C tier. It's not quite D tier, because, I mean, it is powerful. But it's another one of those crowd control effects that don't do enough for me to bother with them. Being attached to the troll, I forget exactly when Fear comes online. Is it like level 9 or 10? Maybe? Being attached to the troll, it is decent. Because, you know, it's free. But it's just not good enough, in my opinion. It just doesn't quite do it for me. The other spell effect, however, that the troll gets access to is the only other source of dig in the game. I forget what this one's even called. It's like Power Strike or something. We're going to put this one at the bottom of S tier, okay? It is unique to the troll, and it is a dig spell. I believe it's a little bit more expensive in terms of mana than dig. But what it also does is, I think it's a double damage strike with your unarmed attack as a troll, which can be pretty cool for just, you know, bopping somebody, especially if you sneak up on them and then cast the spell and just absolutely punch them in half. However, because it is, it's tied to the troll form, which cuts your mana regen naturally, and it can only be found in the troll form, it's not nearly as good, as flexible as dig. Plus, it's a melee hit. You have to be right up on the wall. Dig lets you shoot ahead of you, so you can deal with like traps and stuff that are across gaps and things like that. Overall, just not nearly as good as dig, but still worth putting into S tier because digging is a very, very rare effect. Next up, we have the Imp form, and if I remember right, this is the level 13 Shaman bonus. Is it 13? Actually, it might be like 9 or something earlier than that. Either way, the Imp form is, it's S tier. Imp form gives you a massive bonus to your intelligence. You get a permanent levitate effect while you're in Imp form. You can still wield books and I believe staves or staffs, which is obviously very powerful. As I mentioned earlier in this discussion, or I mean maybe in the previous video, depending on if I cut this in half. But either way, Imp form is capable of using those spellbooks that have been boosted to ridiculous levels, making it an insanely powerful option, especially because with the heavy int bonus that you get, you also are getting your damage boosted from your high intelligence. Unsurprisingly, the Imp mostly levels your intelligence. I think they do perception a little bit as well. Not sure other than that. Intelligence is all that really matters with the Imp, though. Nothing else comes close. The Imp does get 2 spells. Neither of those spells are unique to the Imp, though. Both of these can be found elsewhere in the dungeon without any issue. The first one is Lightning Blast. You might notice, or you might recognize the Lightning Bolt spell from all the times that gnomes have killed you with it, using lightning staffs in the gnomish mines. However, the lightning spell is pretty good. I would actually say it's here. It's the only damage spell, I think, that we didn't talk about when we were talking about damage spells. And it's pretty solid. I think it's around the same damage as like a magic missile or something. Both of these are higher than Fireball or Bloodletting are, I believe, generally speaking. Lightning doesn't have any unique like status effects or anything like that, so it's kind of low. But overall, the damage that it can output is pretty solid for sure. The other effect that the Imp has is a self-buffing spell that also goes into S tier. This is Elemental Focus. It's probably the best self-buffing spell in the game, what it does is it allows you to, well, there's maybe one exception to that, but it allows you to cast your elemental spells at a higher potency. Up until the new spellbook meta, this was one of the few ways to really boost your DPS as a mage. It was basically this and Arcane Mark, and you comboed these two and just melted stuff. It still works like that, basically. I believe that Elemental Focus lowers the range on your elemental spells, which is like one kind of weird weakness of it. But it's relatively cheap and easy to maintain, especially when you're in Imp form, because you have heightened mana regen from your higher than normal intelligence. Overall, it's a very solid option if you're playing as any kind of mage class and you get this. Toss that on during a boss fight and just melt the enemy. Now we can finally talk about the 4 spells that are left to discuss in the game. There are a few others, I think there's 3 or 4 others that cannot be accessed in any way. You can't get them, you can't cast them. They're either shopkeeper exclusive, unused, or locked behind some other enemy or trap or something. The first one is Charm Monster. Now, Charm Monster is unique to the Mesmer class, which is the Succubus racial class, and is, well, it's my second favorite class in the entire game. Charm Monster, on the other hand, is not my favorite spell in the game. Now, I'm going to be extremely generous to Charm Monster, and I'm going to put this bad boy up here in B tier. I wish I could put it higher. The strength of Charm Monster is that Charm Monster will work on most any enemy, and they do not need to be low on HP. Dominate wants enemies to be low on HP before you cast it, obviously. Charm Monster, the things you want to do are, you want to confuse the enemy, or throw alcohol at them to get them drunk, or... Does sleep affect that, actually? I don't remember. Either way, confuse is kind of the main one. I think paralyze might also help a bit as well. Regardless, Charm Monster is really good in that sense, right? You can charm enemies, and it's pretty good. You don't have to weaken them or anything. It's a great time. However, the issue with Charm Monster, the downside of it, is that you can only ever have one charmed monster. So while Dominate can have an infinite number, and while having 100 in leadership can give you up to 6 followers, Charm Monster will only ever allow 1. This has been a pretty big weakness of the Mesmer class and the Charm Monster spell just in general since pretty much forever. I think, generally speaking, Charm Monster would be heavily buffed if they put a cap on how many dominated enemies you can have. Because then it would be like, okay, I can have 4 enemies dominated, I can have 6 enemies through my leadership, and I can have 1 via charm. There'd be a reason to want to charm things. But I think a more interesting take would be if your charmed monster got like special buffs, right? If the charmed status from this spell also gave the target like higher defense and more strength or something like that, right? To make it so that the Mesmer's class simp can really like go toe-to-toe with anything out there, and kind of compensate for the fact that the Dominate spell has a whole army. Instead of having a whole army, you have one really powerful guy, right? That being said, it's not terrible. In the early game, when you can finally cast it as the Mesmer, you can get a really powerful troll, maybe a Thumpus or a Funny Bones or something like that, and it's pretty good, for sure. I've had Mesmer games where I walked out the front door of Spawn, and there was a Funny Bones walking at me, and I used my Staff of Charm Monster to just get him. And then I was good for a while, right, because he was pretty powerful. But overall, Charm only exists for one class. That class is mostly built around it in the early game, so it's pretty good. If you find like a Staff of Charm Monster in the dungeon, it is worth using for sure. But just keep in mind, you can only ever have the one, and I do think it needs a little bit of a buff, personally. Next up is Inner Demon. This is a spell that is unique to the Punisher class, and is another weird one, as is keeping with the Punisher. Now, I'm going to put this one tentatively into C tier, but I think I'm going to put it at the top of C tier. In fact, I think I'm going to put it here. Early on, it's kind of a bad spell to use because it takes about 15% of your HP every time you cast it. I think it was 15% anyway. This is not insignificant in the early game, but as you get towards the late game and you have healing options, better regen, that kind of thing, it doesn't matter as much. What it does is it uses your health to conjure a ghostly enemy, basically, a green glowing demon ghoul, that sits there and laughs at your opponent while your opponent desperately tries to punch it to make the noises stop. Overall, it's not bad, and it's great for the Punisher class specifically, who is, again, the only person in the game who can get it is the Punisher. It doesn't exist as a spellbook as far as I'm aware. But it's particularly good for the Punisher because the Punisher doesn't start with very good stealth stats, despite kind of wanting to be a little bit of a sneaky boyo. So it's kind of nice to be able to cast this on something, run behind them, and just whip them in the ass over and over again until eventually you defeat them, and or the inner demon spell runs out and they beat you to death. Why I put this one so high is because as you get into the mid to late game and you get a lot more HP and stuff, it becomes, I think, easier to spam this out. A lot safer because you have a bigger pool of health to draw on. Even though it's costing you more health because it's always 15%, it doesn't matter as much, you know? When you only have, you know, let's say 50 health, losing like 8-ish of that hurts, right? Like that's, you don't love that. You're like, I don't know about that one. I don't really want to lose that kind of HP. When you're at, you know, 200 health and casting it costs you, what, 30 HP? You're like, whatever, I got 170 more. I don't care. So overall, Inner Demon, it kind of scales weirdly. It becomes more useful the later the game gets, but you also might use it less because you don't need it. It's in kind of a weird spot. If I were going to buff the Inner Demon spell personally, I would add either a longer duration to it to make it a little bit more impactful, or I would make it so that maybe when it is killed, not when it disappears, but if the enemy kills it, like lowers its HP to 0, it might explode, light enemies on fire, not do a ton of damage, but like something like that, you know? That would really fit in with the kind of trickstery nature of the Punisher class in general. Next up, we have the Vampiric Aura spell, which is sort of a weird one, because this is unique to the Accursed. Now I'm just going to put this one up into A tier right now, because that's where it's going to be. It's very low in A tier, but it is very good. Oh my god. I don't know if you guys could hear the truck that just went past my house. It rumbled my floorboards, and I'm like 100 feet away from the road. Like, I'm not close to the road. Whatever. Anyway, Vampiric Aura. What makes this special is when you start off the game as the Accursed, you cannot turn this spell off. It's not even really a spell at that point. It's just baked into your stats, right? It makes your hunger go down very, very quickly, and makes it so that you can drink blood, and blood will also drop for you just as if you were a vampire. In exchange, it gives you some pretty massive boosts to your stats. I think it's like +6 to your strength and dex or something wild like that. It's pretty massive. When you get to the Mystic Library level, which is the first secret floor in the ruins area, I believe, you get the option. Well, you can find a book in there, in one of the chests, that gives you the option to toggle the Vampiric Aura on and off. So you can turn it on when you want to fight somebody who's scary, you can turn it off when you just want to chillax with your dudes, right? Overall, pretty solid option. The reason I won't put it any higher is, first off, it comes with downsides, right? It comes with the hunger penalty. Second of all, it's only available to one class, so obviously I can't put it in S tier or anything. When it also has downsides. Like, it's rare, it has downsides, you don't get to overcome those downsides until like halfway through the game, and then in addition to that, the effects, the benefits are good, but they're not that good, right? So it goes down here, as opposed to something like, you know, the troll punchy move, which is, yes, class specific, it's also very strong and versatile, as opposed to this, which is pretty good, pretty strong, not that versatile though. Now we can finally talk about the very, very final spell in the game, which is Conjure Skeleton. Conjure Skeleton will summon 1 or 2, depending on your levels and stuff, skeletons, one of which is a melee boy with a shield and a stick, and the other one is a ranged boy who has a ranged weapon of some kind. These skeletons will level. They will start off with basically like leather and like bronze tier gear, essentially, and then they will level up to iron, and then up to... do they get steel stuff? I think? And then they go up all the way to crystal eventually, if you level them up high enough. The skeleton archer starts with a slingshot, moves to a... I think it moves to a bow, and then they move to a crossbow at the end. So overall, pretty good. This is one of the innate spells. You don't get a spell book of this, it's just built into you as a character, so as I'm currently doing in my Goblin Conjurer run, obviously you can be a Goblin Conjurer and you get access to this spell for free, which is cool. I don't know if I said it, but this is the Conjurer unique spell as well. Overall, this one is kind of a weird one to place because, like, you know, where does it go exactly? I think that, to be fair to it, I'm going to put it in A tier. Very, very high. I'm thinking here. I don't think it's quite an S tier spell. It's not nearly as strong as Dominate. It doesn't compete with the utility of these other spells that are on here, really, and doesn't compare to the raw damage that you can output at this tier either, so... it stays here. It's very good. Early on, you can use your conjured skeletons to fight for you, and make them activate traps for you, and all that kind of stuff. It's a pretty forgiving spell, all things considered, and if you play like a little baby boy, it's very safe as well. Highly recommend it. But overall, it just doesn't quite compete with anything that's like up here, in my opinion. But that being said, that's it. That's all the spells in Barony, I believe. I hope I didn't miss any. If I did, let me know, and I will make an addendum to the video, as well as a long, heartfelt ukulele apology for you guys for forgetting something. That's a joke, I don't own a ukulele. But, thanks for tuning in, thanks for watching this video. Next up, I'm probably going to be doing one final Barony tier list for right now. There might be technically 2 more eventually, but 1 more for now. This was the most important one that I definitely wanted to get, because looking back at the old tier list, I think I missed out on a bunch of spells because they weren't on the site. So I'm glad that I've dealt with that and taken care of that now. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you guys learned something from this, or maybe, you know, got some useful advice. Something useful out of this video, at least. But until the next one, you know, have a good one, you guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you're enjoying the Barony content, and really just the content in general. And, you know, until next time, as I say, peace.